A crime can begin in a room so ordinary that its first clues look almost too small to carry history. Mud on a nursery floor, unclear footprints in the earth below a window, a handwritten demand left on a sill. But on the night of March 1st, 1932, those small details opened into something far larger than one family's terror. They became the first marks in a case that would draw police power, celebrity, forensic argument, ransom negotiations, federal attention, and the American press into the same narrow frame. The room was on the second floor of the Lindbergh home near Hopewell, New Jersey. The child was Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., 20 months old, the son of Charles A. Lindbergh and Anne Morrow Lindbergh. By about 9 o'clock that night, according to the established record, he had been taken from the nursery. At approximately 10 o'clock, his nurse, Betty Gow, reported him missing. That hour between the estimated abduction and the alarm is one of the first silences in the story. Not an empty silence, but the kind that investigators later try to fill with objects, marks, and timing. What happened at the nursery window? Who came to the house? How long did they remain? What did they touch? What did they leave behind? The first answers were not confessions or eyewitnesses. They were physical traces, fragile and incomplete. The Lindbergh estate near Hopewell was rural, a private place set apart from the dense public life that already surrounded Charles Lindbergh's name. The FBI later described the property as a 390-acre rural estate. That setting matters. The house was not a city apartment, not a room above a crowded street, not a place where strangers might be expected to pass in number. The isolation was part of its privacy, but on this night, it also shaped the crime scene. Whoever approached the second-floor nursery did so at a home where darkness, distance, and the surrounding land could become cover. The window became the first center of gravity. From the second floor, it connected the protected interior of the house to the outside ground below. Investigators found mud traces in the nursery. Beneath the nursery window, there were footprints, but they could not be measured clearly. That detail is important because it shows the case from its first hours as both rich in suggestion and poor in certainty. Mud meant someone had carried the outside in. Footprints suggested movement beneath the window. But unclear prints could not become precise measurements. They pointed toward a path, but did not yet identify a person. Then there was the ransom note. It was found on the nursery windowsill and demanded $50,000. In practical terms, it announced that the disappearance was not only an abduction, but an extortion. In emotional terms, it changed the room from a place of panic into a place of instruction. Someone unseen had entered the family's private space, removed a child, and left behind a written demand. The note forced the Lindberghs and investigators to respond to a voice without a face. That is one of the disturbing mechanics of ransom. It allows the person holding power to remain absent. The family must wait. Police must infer. Every word becomes evidence, but also a threat. The note in the nursery did not solve the mystery of how the child had been taken. It deepened it because it suggested planning, purpose, and a continued relationship between the kidnapper and the family. The child was gone, but the person who took him had not disappeared from the story. He had begun to write it. The first report came through Betty Gow, the nurse whose discovery placed the household into emergency. At approximately 10 o'clock, the absence of the child became known as a crime. That moment is easy to flatten into a timeline, but its significance is deeper. Before the report, the event was contained in action already taken. A child removed, a note left, traces made. After the report, the house began to change. It was no longer only the Lindbergh home. It was a crime scene. And because of who lived there, it could never remain only local for long. Still, in these first hours, before the later courtroom, before the name Bruno Richard Hauptmann, before the marked ransom money and the wood forensic arguments, the case was concentrated in a few physical facts. A 20-month-old child had been taken from a second-floor nursery near Hopewell. The alarm had been raised by Nurse Betty Gow. There was mud in the nursery. There were unclear footprints below the window. There was a ransom note demanding $50,000. A homemade ladder would become associated with the abduction, and investigators would later focus closely on how it had been used to reach the nursery window. But at the beginning, the scene was still raw, unsettled, and vulnerable to every pressure that would soon arrive. The pressure came first from the need to act quickly. A kidnapped child might still be alive. A ransom note meant communication could follow. Every hour mattered, and yet haste could damage the very evidence that might later matter most. That contradiction sits at the center of the early investigation. The family needed action. Police needed control. The scene needed protection. The public, once the story broke outward, would demand information. These needs did not always fit together neatly. The nursery window also carried a symbolic force that newspapers and the public would soon understand instinctively. It was not a bank vault, a train platform, or a roadside ambush. It was a child's room. The violation was intimate. The route of entry and exit, as understood from the evidence around the window and the ladder, made the crime feel both calculated and strangely physical. Someone had approached a private house in rural New Jersey, reached a second-floor nursery, and left with the child of one of the most famous men in America. But for now, the fame is not the whole story. The fame explains the scale of what followed, not the horror of the first discovery. In the first hour after Betty Gow reported the child missing, the catastrophe belonged to a family and a household. A child was absent from his bed. The room held traces that did not yet speak clearly. The ransom note supplied a demand, but not reassurance. Even the amount, $50,000, gave the event a structure without giving it mercy. True crime often becomes most familiar through its later artifacts: the trial exhibit, the mugshot, the courthouse sketch, the final verdict. The Lindbergh case would have all of those and more. It would become a national spectacle. It would help drive changes in federal kidnapping law. Its trial would later be remembered as a media storm significant enough to influence courtroom rules around cameras and radio. But none of that was visible yet in the nursery itself. What was visible was a window. A window is both boundary and weakness. It is part of the home, but it opens outward. On March 1st, 1932, the nursery window near Hopewell became the place where private life and public crime first touched. It framed the earliest questions investigators had to ask: how the kidnapper reached the second floor, what traces were left behind, and whether the ransom note could lead to the child's return. The first clues did not form a complete picture. They rarely do. Mud traces were not an identity. Footprints that could not be measured were not a name. A ransom note was not a confession. Yet together they established the shape of the crime. The abduction had been deliberate enough to include a written demand, bold enough to reach the nursery, and consequential enough that law enforcement would soon move around the Lindbergh home in widening circles. By the end of that night, the rural estate near Hopewell had become two things at once. It was still the home of Charles A. Lindbergh and Anne Morrow Lindbergh, parents facing the disappearance of their child. But it was also the first stage of a public criminal drama. The nursery window, the mud, the uncertain footprints, and the note demanding $50,000 were the opening record of a case that would not remain inside the house for long. The next force to enter the room was not only the police. It was the weight of the Lindbergh name itself, turning a private abduction into a national event almost as soon as the alarm was raised. The weight of the Lindbergh name did not change the physical facts in the nursery. The window was still a window. The note was still a piece of paper. The traces below the house were still fragile marks in soil. But it changed the meaning of everything around them. It changed who came, how quickly they came, and how far the case would travel beyond the borders of a rural New Jersey estate. The missing child was Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., 20 months old, the son of Charles A. Lindbergh and Anne Morrow Lindbergh. That relationship made the crime national almost from the moment it was understood as a kidnapping. Charles Lindbergh was not simply a well-known man. He was one of the most famous Americans of his time, known across the country after his solo transatlantic flight in 1927. His name belonged to aviation, to modern celebrity, and to a public imagination that had already turned him into a symbol. Anne Morrow Lindbergh also belonged to a public world. The Lindbergh family was watched because people believed they knew what the family represented: achievement, glamour, youth, modernity, and a kind of national pride. Yet the crime itself happened in a place chosen, in part, for distance from that public gaze. The Lindbergh home near Hopewell, New Jersey, stood on a rural estate that the FBI later described as 390 acres. The setting matters because it sharpened the contradiction at the center of the case. A family had sought privacy in the countryside. A kidnapper had entered that privacy through the second-floor nursery. And then the outside world began pressing in. The first police notification was local. Hopewell police were told that the child was missing. But the case did not remain a local police matter for long. The New Jersey State Police initially assumed charge of the investigation after Hopewell police were notified. Under Superintendent H. Norman Schwarzkopf, the state police became the central law enforcement authority in the first stage of the case. That early assumption of control tells us something important. Even before later federal involvement, even before the ransom trail expanded, the kidnapping was treated as an event requiring more than an ordinary local response. The reasons were plain. The victim was an infant from a famous household. The crime had taken place at night, at home, from a nursery. A ransom demand had been left behind. And the name Lindbergh ensured that every step taken by investigators would be followed, interpreted, and amplified. This was the beginning of the case as a public event, but also the beginning of a different kind of pressure on police work. The investigation had to move quickly, but the evidence in front of investigators was delicate, limited, and exposed to uncertainty. At the center of the first scene was the window area. The child had been taken from the second-floor nursery. Beneath that window, investigators found footprints, but those prints could not be measured. That limitation is easy to pass over, but it was crucial. A measurable footprint might have offered size, direction, or comparison. An uncertain trace could suggest movement without proving enough. In a case that would later depend on physical evidence, the earliest ground beneath the window gave investigators something less than a firm answer. There were mud traces in the nursery. Those traces connected the inside of the room to the outside world, but they did not, by themselves, identify the person who carried the mud in. Like the footprints below the window, the mud mattered because it marked intrusion. It suggested a path. It showed that the nursery, which should have been separate from the night air and the ground outside, had been breached. But mud is also a fragile kind of evidence. It can be disturbed, tracked, misread, or lost. In the opening hours of the Lindbergh investigation, the scene was already a struggle between meaning and damage. The ransom note on the nursery windowsill carried a different kind of force. It was not accidental residue. It was a message. The note demanded $50,000, turning the disappearance into an organized demand for money. In practical terms, the note gave investigators a starting point. The crime was not merely a missing child case, but a kidnapping with ransom terms. In emotional terms, it created a terrible structure for the family. Their child was gone, and the person responsible had left instructions in the place where he had slept. The note also made the case communicative. From the beginning, the kidnapper, or kidnappers, did not only act, they addressed the family. They used writing to impose control from a distance. That pattern would deepen as further ransom notes entered the case, but the first one had already established the basic arrangement. The family would be forced to read, respond, wait, and hope, while investigators tried to convert those communications into evidence. Then there was the latter. In the first stage, it appeared as a practical object associated with the abduction, a homemade means of reaching the nursery window. The FBI summary later stated that 2 sections of the ladder had been used to reach the window, and that 1 section was split or broken where it joined another. But even before those details became part of a larger forensic story, the ladder stood for the planning behind the act. Someone had brought or used a device suited to the architecture of the house. Someone had approached a second-floor room not by entering normally, but by creating a temporary route from the ground to the child's window. This is where the private home became a crime scene in the fullest sense. A crime scene is not only a place where something happened. It is a place where ordinary objects and surfaces are reclassified. A sill becomes the location of a ransom note. Soil becomes a record of uncertain footprints. Mud becomes an indicator of movement. A ladder becomes an instrument of entry. The nursery becomes both a room and a field of evidence. But the Lindbergh house was never allowed to be only that. It was also a symbolic place because of who lived there. The transformation from home to crime scene occurred under the shadow of celebrity. That did not make the facts more reliable. It made the demand for answers more intense. A local abduction in another family might have remained known mainly to police, neighbors, and nearby newspapers. This one drew institutional attention almost immediately because the public already knew the parents' names. That is one of the central tensions in the Lindbergh case. Power did not appear only as political authority or police command. It appeared through fame. Celebrity created urgency. It widened the circle of concern. It drew state law enforcement around the family estate and helped turn the crime into a national matter before the evidence itself had been stabilized. The child's identity shaped the investigation's scale from the beginning. This did not mean that investigators had clear answers. The early case remained physically narrow: a nursery, a window, a ransom note, mud, unmeasurable footprints, and the ladder. The evidence was tangible but incomplete. The crime felt enormous because of the Lindbergh name, yet the first clues were small and vulnerable. That imbalance would define much of what followed. The institutions around the case would grow larger. The public attention would become louder. But the work still depended on objects that could be held, examined, compared, and argued over. On March 2, 1932, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover offered FBI assistance to Superintendent H. Norman Schwarzkopf. At first, the FBI acted only in an auxiliary capacity because there was no federal jurisdiction over the case. That detail reveals the legal boundary still in place at the time. However famous the victim, however national the public alarm, kidnapping itself did not automatically make the investigation a federal case. The machinery of federal authority had not yet fully entered. It would come later, under pressure from this very case and its consequences. For now, the New Jersey State Police held the lead, with federal help offered but limited. This early arrangement is important because it shows the case suspended between levels of power. The crime happened in New Jersey. The first charge of investigation belonged to New Jersey. Yet the name Lindbergh made it impossible for the case to feel confined to New Jersey. Newspapers, public attention, and federal interest all gathered around a crime whose first physical record remained fixed at one window on a rural estate near Hopewell. That contrast is the quiet engine of the story. A family home became a stage for institutions. A nursery became the starting point for a national investigation. A ransom note turned private terror into a negotiation. And a ladder, made for a single night's access, began its long movement from tool to clue to one of the most closely examined objects in the case. For investigators, the challenge was to slow the story down. Public attention wanted drama, certainty, and a culprit. Police work needed preservation, comparison, and patience. The window area had to be understood. The note had to be kept and studied. The ladder had to be examined, not merely as an object left behind, but as a possible record of the person who built it, handled it, or used it. The uncertain traces below the nursery could not carry the case by themselves, but they framed the route. The mud inside the nursery suggested contact between the intruder and the room. Each detail was incomplete. Together, they began to form the first theory of movement. And so the investigation narrowed again, even as the public world expanded around it. Behind the famous name, behind the state police command, behind the first signs of federal attention, there remained a handmade ladder and a second-floor window. To understand how police tried to turn chaos into proof, the case has to return to that object, its sections, its break, its placement, and the possibility that wood itself could remember what people tried to hide. The ladder belonged to the same narrow world as the nursery window, close, physical, and stubbornly incomplete. It did not explain the crime by itself. It could not name the person who carried it across the Lindbergh property near Hopewell, New Jersey. It could not say whether one person or more than one had planned the approach. But unlike a footprint that could not be measured, or mud that could only suggest movement, the ladder could be held, preserved, and examined. It was an object with structure. It had been made by someone. It had been used for a purpose. And in the first hours of the investigation, that made it one of the most important things left behind. The FBI summary describes it as a homemade ladder associated with the abduction. That word, homemade, matters. This was not simply a ladder taken from a shed and returned to the ground. It was an improvised tool, assembled to solve a specific problem: how to reach the second-floor nursery window of the Lindbergh home. According to the FBI, 2 sections of the ladder had been used to reach the window. One section was split or broken where it joined another. From the beginning, then, the ladder was more than a route upward. It was evidence of planning, of construction, and possibly of strain under use. For investigators, the ladder offered the first practical theory of the crime. The child's nursery was on the second floor. The ransom note had been found on the nursery windowsill. Mud traces were present inside the nursery. Footprints were found beneath the window, but they could not be measured. Those facts did not form a complete chain, but they pointed toward a movement, from the ground outside, up to the window, into the child's room, and back out again. The ladder made that movement plausible. At the same time, the ladder also exposed the limits of what investigators had. The footprints beneath the window were not the kind of clear impressions that could be turned into exact measurements. They could suggest a presence below the nursery, but they could not reliably identify a shoe, a stride, or a person. The mud in the nursery suggested that something from outside had entered the room, but it did not by itself say who brought it there. In a case already drawing extraordinary attention because of the Lindbergh name, the physical scene remained fragile. The evidence did not speak in full sentences. It offered fragments. That is why the ladder became so important. It was not as vulnerable as a mark in soft earth. It was not a stain to be interpreted only by location and context. It was wood. It had sections. It had joins. It had damage. It could be studied again and again. The split or break where one section joined another was especially suggestive because it connected the object to the physical stress of the crime. If the ladder had broken during use, then the escape route may not have been as controlled as the plan required. The abduction, in that reading, was not a smooth operation carried out without difficulty. It involved a tool that may have failed at a critical point. But early theories had to be handled carefully. A broken ladder could mean many things. It could have been poorly made. It could have been damaged before it was used. It could have split under weight. It could have broken while being carried, placed, climbed, or removed. Investigators could see the damage, but they still had to determine what kind of meaning it could bear. That tension would follow the case for years, the desire to make physical evidence tell a clear story, and the difficulty of proving exactly how each piece fit. The ladder also stood between two forms of evidence, the immediate and the future. In the first hours, it helped investigators understand how the nursery window might have been reached. Later, it would become one of the central forensic exhibits in the case against Bruno Richard Hauptmann. The prosecution's case would eventually include wood evidence from the ladder, along with tool marks and nail hole patterns. Wood scientist Arthur Kohler of the U.S. Forest Service Forest Products Laboratory would examine the ladder, and the United States Department of Agriculture later described the case as an early major use of wood forensics in a trial. The New Jersey State Archives states that trial evidence linked wood used in the kidnap ladder to wood found in Hauptmann's home and to a lumber yard where he had formerly worked. Those later developments belong to a different stage of the story, but their importance begins here, with the decision to treat the ladder not merely as debris at a crime scene, but as a record. Wood can carry traces of human action. It can show how it was cut, shaped, joined, and fastened. It can preserve tool marks. It can reveal nail holes. It can point towards species, source, and workmanship. In one sense, the ladder was a crude object. In another, it was a document. That idea would become increasingly important as the investigation tried to move from panic to proof. The earliest hours after the kidnapping were marked by urgency. A child was missing. A ransom note demanded $50,000. Police had to search, protect the scene, listen to witnesses, and follow whatever immediate leads seemed possible. Yet the same scene also had to be preserved for a slower kind of work. If the case became a prosecution, objects would matter differently. They would have to survive scrutiny. They would have to be described in court. They would have to be connected to a suspect by something stronger than suspicion. The ladder was a first attempt at that transformation. It began as a tool used by the abductor or abductors. Then it became a clue in the hands of investigators. Later, it would become an exhibit, something shown and interpreted within the formal power of a courtroom. The distance between those roles is significant. A tool is made for action. A clue is made meaningful by investigation. An exhibit is made meaningful by law. In the Lindbergh case, the ladder traveled through all three identities. The broken section deepened its narrative power because it seemed to contain an event. A complete ladder might simply suggest preparation. A broken one suggested difficulty. It introduced the possibility of noise, haste, weight, imbalance, or error. But again, possibility was not proof. The challenge for investigators was to keep the object from becoming only a symbol. The ladder had to be measured against what could actually be known: its construction, its placement, its damage, and its relationship to the second-floor window. That was the quiet discipline behind the early scene work. The officers and investigators were not only asking what had happened, they were asking what could still be demonstrated after the fact. The mud in the nursery could support the idea that someone entered from outside. The footprints beneath the window could support the idea of movement near the base of the house, but not in a precise, measurable way. The ladder could support the idea of access to the nursery window. Together, these elements produced the first theory. An intruder approached the house, used the ladder to reach the second floor, entered or reached into the nursery area, and left with the child. Even that theory left open major questions. It did not identify the intruder. It did not prove whether the person knew the house, watched the family, or came with prior knowledge of the nursery. It did not explain how the ransom demand had been prepared, or how communication would continue. It did not resolve whether the split ladder section had caused a fall, a delay, or any injury. It only marked the outline of a route. In a less famous crime that might have been the work of a local investigation moving in relative quiet. But this was the Lindbergh home. The child was Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., son of Charles Lindbergh and Anne Morrow Lindbergh. The house near Hopewell had already become a place where private grief, police procedure, and national attention collided. Every object in the scene risked becoming public property in the imagination of the country. The latter, especially, was easy to picture. A homemade wooden structure against a rural house at night. A second-floor nursery window. A child gone. But the real investigative value of the latter did not come from how vividly it could be imagined. It came from how stubbornly material it was. It could be inspected when memories changed. It could be compared when suspects emerged. It could be tested against claims, tools, wood, and workmanship. In a case that would eventually depend heavily on circumstantial evidence, that mattered. Circumstantial evidence is built by accumulation. No single object may carry the entire burden, but each piece can narrow the field if it is handled with care. The early scene offered investigators both promise and frustration. The footprints were present, but not measurable. The mud was visible, but not identifying. The ransom note was direct, but anonymous. The ladder was damaged, but silent. The case began with a strange combination of clarity and uncertainty. Everyone knew a child had been taken, and yet almost nothing definitively identified the person who had taken him. So the ladder became the first major object around which the investigation could organize itself. It gave the abduction a physical root. It gave later forensic work a starting point. And it revealed the central problem of the entire case: the need to turn what had been left behind into evidence strong enough to survive the noise gathering outside the Lindbergh home. While investigators studied wood, mud, and broken sections, the person behind the ransom demand still controlled the next movement of the case. The ladder showed how the nursery might have been reached. The note on the sill showed how the family would be pressured. Soon, the investigation would move from the house near Hopewell into a wider geography of messages, postmarks, and demands, where handwriting and money would become tools of power as surely as the ladder had been a tool of entry. The ladder gave investigators a possible path into the nursery. The note gave the kidnapper, or kidnappers, a path back out. That was the next movement of the case. Not a footprint in the soil, not a broken section of wood, not mud carried into a room, but language. A written demand could cross distance without exposing the writer. It could enter the Lindbergh home after the child had been taken. It could force decisions from people who still did not know who they were dealing with, where the child was, or whether any promise attached to the ransom demand could be trusted. The first note had already been found on the nursery windowsill. Its demand was direct: $50,000. In the physical story of the abduction, that note sat beside the window and the ladder. It belonged to the same scene as the open route into the second-floor nursery. But it also belonged to a different kind of crime scene, one that would not be contained by the Lindbergh estate near Hopewell, New Jersey. A ransom note is evidence, but it is also an instrument. It does not simply report what has happened. It tries to make something happen next. It tells the family what role they are supposed to play. It tells investigators that the missing child is now part of a negotiation. It narrows attention toward money, timing, and obedience. And in this case, it turned the aftermath of an abduction into a sequence of contacts that would be watched, interpreted, and eventually argued over in court. From the beginning, the written demand changed the balance of power. Charles Lindbergh and Anne Morrow Lindbergh were famous, surrounded by public attention, and quickly supported by law enforcement. The New Jersey State Police had assumed charge after Hopewell police were notified. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had offered assistance to New Jersey State Police Superintendent H. Norman Schwarzkopf on March 2, 1932, though the FBI's role at first remained auxiliary because there was no federal jurisdiction. Institutions were gathering around the case, but the writer of the note did not need to appear before those institutions. The writer did not need to walk into a police station or face the family. The note allowed control from a distance. It forced everyone else to react. That distance became more visible when a second ransom note arrived. It was postmarked Brooklyn, New York, March 4, 1932. Charles Lindbergh received it on March 6th. The demand had changed. The amount was no longer $50,000. It had risen to $70,000. The increase mattered because it showed that the crime had not stopped at the nursery window. The abduction had entered a second phase. The writer was still communicating. The demand was not fixed. The terms could shift. The family could be made to wait, read, decide, and fear that any move might affect the child's fate. The Brooklyn postmark also widened the map. The first scene was rural New Jersey, a large estate near Hopewell, a second-floor nursery, traces beneath a window, a homemade ladder. The second note carried the case toward New York. It did not prove who wrote it. It did not prove where the child was. A postmark is a point in a mail system, not a confession. But it gave investigators and the family another concrete marker. Brooklyn, March 4th, received March 6th. In a case already swelling under public pressure, that was enough to matter. The geography of the investigation was beginning to stretch. Hopewell remained the center of the loss, but the communication suggested a broader operating field. The person or people behind the ransom demand could use ordinary systems, including the mail, to project power into the Lindbergh household while remaining unseen. This is one reason the ransom notes became so important. They were not dramatic props. They were the working machinery of the crime. Each note created a moment of forced interpretation. Was the demand genuine? Did it come from the person who had taken the child? Did the change in amount signal confidence, impatience, or calculation? How should the family respond? How much should police control? How much should be kept private? And how much would inevitably leak into a public world already fixed on the Lindbergh name? Those questions sat at the intersection of crime and power. The Lindberghs were not ordinary public figures. Charles Lindbergh was one of the best-known Americans of his time. His family's private grief could not easily be separated from public fascination. Yet the ransom note reduced even a famous family to the role assigned by the writer: wait, pay, comply, and hope. For investigators, the notes offered a different challenge. The latter had physical properties. It could be examined for wood, construction, breaks, tool marks, and use. A note had its own physical and human features. It could be preserved. Its wording could be studied. Its handwriting could be compared. Its route through the mail could be considered. But none of that made it simple. Handwriting, especially, would become one of the later battlegrounds of the case. The prosecution's case against Bruno Richard Hauptmann would eventually include handwriting evidence, along with ransom money, identification testimony, tool marks, and wood evidence from the latter. But at this early stage, the notes did not yet identify a suspect. They did something more immediate. They kept the case moving under the direction of a hidden author. That is the cruel efficiency of a ransom note. It can make the victim's family act while giving them almost nothing in return. It can create urgency without clarity. It can command money without proving safety. It can be studied by police and still remain, at the moment it is received, a message from the dark. By March 6, 1932, the Lindbergh case had therefore become more than a search around a house. The physical evidence from the nursery still mattered. The ladder still mattered. The mud traces and unmeasurable footprints still marked the first hours of confusion. But the written demands had opened a parallel investigation, one built around paper, handwriting, postmarks, money, and controlled communication. The second note's demand for $70,000 also revealed an important asymmetry. Law enforcement had numbers of officers, institutional structures, and public authority. The family had fame, resources, and the desperate need for the child's return. The writer had concealment. Concealment was enough to dominate the early negotiation. Every message created pressure on multiple fronts. For the family, it was emotional and immediate. For investigators, it was procedural. For the press and the public, the existence of ransom demands fed the sense that the case was unfolding in chapters, with each new communication promising a possible turn. This is part of why the kidnapping became an early media trial, even before there was a defendant in court. The public story was already being structured by evidence, rumor, official action, and the expectation of the next development. But inside that public storm, the mechanism remained intimate, a parent receiving a demand concerning a missing child. The second note did not solve the mystery. It deepened it. It showed that whoever was controlling the ransom trail could alter the terms and keep the family suspended between hope and terror. The move from $50,000 to $70,000 was not just an increase in price. It was an assertion of control. It told the Lindberghs that the writer could change the rules. It told investigators that the communications themselves would have to be treated as evidence. And it foreshadowed a case in which written marks on paper would one day be placed beside wood grain, tool marks, and marked currency as pieces of a larger argument. For now, though, there was no trial. There was no named defendant. There was only the child still missing, the family waiting, police trying to interpret what had been left and what had been sent, and a public watching a private negotiation become a national event. The ransom trail needed a channel. Someone would have to move between the hidden writer and the visible world of the Lindbergh family, police, newspapers, and public appeals. That space between desperation and procedure was where an unlikely figure would soon enter, a retired Bronx school principal who signed himself with a code name and who would become known in the case as Jafsie. The ransom trail needed a channel, and in the first days of March, that channel did not come from a police laboratory or a courthouse. It came from the public space that already surrounded the case, the newspaper. Dr. John F. Condon was a retired Bronx school principal. He was not, at the beginning, a detective assigned to the Lindbergh investigation. He was not a member of the New Jersey State Police. He was not part of the Lindbergh household. His entrance came through an offer published in the Bronx Home News, a local paper in New York City. From that point, Condon became one of the most unusual figures in the case, a private citizen drawn into a national kidnapping investigation by way of public communication. That fact matters because the Lindbergh kidnapping had already moved beyond the boundaries of a conventional crime scene. The nursery near Hopewell, New Jersey, had produced physical evidence: the window, the mud traces, the unclear footprints, the homemade ladder, the first ransom note. Then the second ransom note, postmarked Brooklyn, New York, on March 4, 1932, and received by Charles Lindbergh on March 6th, had increased the demand from $50,000 to $70,000. The writer, or writers, had shown that communication itself would be part of the crime. Condon entered precisely at that fragile point, when messages were not merely descriptions of events, but instruments of pressure. The person demanding ransom could remain hidden. The family could not. Police could investigate, but the urgency of recovering the child meant that negotiation could not be treated as a distant legal problem. The Lindbergh family, the authorities, and the public were all being pulled into the same field of action, but each from a different position. Condon's code name was Jafsie. In the record of the case, that name became more than a nickname. It marked a role. It marked an identity used inside the strange language of ransom contact, where people appeared through aliases, notes, public notices, and coded signatures, rather than through ordinary introductions. Jafsie belonged to a world where a retired school principal could become a bridge between an unseen extortionist and one of the most famous families in America. The offer in the Bronx Home News also shows how much the case depended on public channels, even when the subject was painfully private. A newspaper item could reach someone who would not walk into a police station. It could invite a response without requiring face-to-face exposure. It could function almost like a message board in a city already crowded with rumor, fear, and attention. In a case where the ransom notes had already established written communication as a method of control, Condon's published offer created another written opening. This was not simply spectatorship. Many people watched the Lindbergh case from a distance, reading headlines or hearing reports. Condon did something different. By offering himself as an intermediary, he moved from the audience into the machinery of the case. He became part of the sequence of events. His actions would help shape how the ransom negotiations unfolded. Later, his testimony and identification would become one piece of the prosecution's circumstantial case against Bruno Richard Hauptmann. But at this stage, there was no Hauptmann in custody, no Flemington trial, no courtroom argument about evidence. There was only an intermediary stepping into a dangerous space. That space was neither fully private nor fully official. It was private because the central terror belonged to the Lindbergh family, a missing 20-month-old child, a demand for money, and the desperate hope that payment might lead to recovery. It was official because the New Jersey State Police had assumed charge after Hopewell police were notified, and the case had already attracted institutional attention beyond New Jersey. It was public because newspapers were not merely reporting events. One of them had become the place where an outsider's offer entered the negotiation. Condon's role therefore exposed one of the central tensions of the Lindbergh kidnapping. The investigation needed control, but the case was constantly generating openings that control could not fully contain. A ransom note on a nursery windowsill. A second note from Brooklyn. A newspaper offer from the Bronx. A code name. Each of these was a point of contact, and each contact carried risk. The person behind the ransom demand could exploit hope. The family had to consider every path that might lead to the child. Police had to weigh the need for evidence against the possibility that strict procedure could cut off communication. In later legal terms, Condon would be important because he was not merely someone who remembered the case afterward. He was not a bystander who saw a suspicious figure on a street and later came forward. He was a participant in the ransom negotiations themselves. He entered the chain of contact before the ransom drop, before the failed directions to the boat called Nellie near Martha's Vineyard, and long before marked ransom money would point investigators toward a suspect in the Bronx. His position gave him a particular kind of significance. He could speak not only about what he heard or read, but about what he did within the exchange. That is why the figure of Jafsie stayed in the case. The nickname may sound almost theatrical now, but in the context of the investigation, it reflected the practical need for identities that could operate within a coded negotiation. The ransom writer, or writers, did not present themselves openly. The man Condon would soon meet would call himself John. The use of names, assumed names, and code names became part of the architecture of the case. Identity was present everywhere, but rarely in a stable form. For investigators, this mattered. A kidnapping investigation depends on linking actions to persons. A note must be connected to a writer. A ladder must be connected to a maker or user. Money must be connected to hands that passed it. A meeting must be connected to a body, a voice, a face, and eventually, if the case reaches court, to a defendant. Condon's future identification would become one attempt to make that kind of link. It would stand alongside other evidence in a prosecution that, years later, would rely heavily on circumstantial connections, ransom money, handwriting evidence, wood evidence, tool marks, and the memory of a witness who had entered the negotiations under the name Jafsie. But in March of 1932, none of those later courtroom structures had yet taken shape. The immediate question was simpler and more urgent. Could contact be maintained long enough to recover the child? The public offer in the Bronx Home News suggested a possible route. It did not solve the crime. It did not identify the kidnapper. It did not guarantee that the person responding had the child or knew where he was. But it created a channel, and in ransom cases, channels can become everything. They can carry instructions. They can carry threats. They can carry false hope. They can also carry evidence, even before anyone fully understands what kind of evidence it will become. Condon's entrance also marks a shift in geography. The case had begun in the quiet, rural setting of the Lindbergh estate near Hopewell, on a property far removed from the dense movement of New York City. With Jafsie, the trail moved toward the Bronx, toward newspapers, streets, and public places where contact might be staged without revealing too much. The kidnapping was still rooted in the second-floor nursery, but the negotiation was expanding into an urban landscape where anonymity was easier to preserve. That movement from isolated home to city contact is one reason the Lindbergh case became so difficult to contain. The physical crime scene was fixed. The ransom process was mobile. Notes could be mailed. Offers could be printed. Meetings could be arranged. Money could be prepared and later traced. Every step widened the map and increased the number of institutions, witnesses, and records that might become relevant. Jafsie stood at the center of that widening map. His presence connected the Bronx home news to the Lindbergh family, private desperation to public messaging, and negotiation to future testimony. He represented the uneasy improvisation that often appears in major criminal investigations before the evidence settles into an official narrative. The authorities had procedures. The family had urgency. The press had reach. Condon, by entering through a newspaper and accepting a code name, became a human passage between all three. The next movement would make that role concrete. The channel opened by public communication would lead to a meeting in a place chosen for its own strange logic, Woodlawn Cemetery, near 233rd Street and Jerome Avenue in the Bronx. There, on March 12, 1932, Jafsie would meet a man calling himself John, and the Lindbergh case would pass from written demands into one of its most haunting face-to-face encounters. Condon had entered the case through print, through the public channel of the Bronx Home News, and through a code name that turned a private citizen into a point of contact. But a code name on a page was still only an opening. The Lindbergh case had already moved from a nursery window to ransom notes, from physical traces to written demands. On March 12, 1932, that movement became a meeting. The place was Woodlawn Cemetery, near 233rd Street and Jerome Avenue in the Bronx. The man who went there was Dr. John F. Condon, the retired Bronx school principal, now known in the Ransom communications as Jafsie. The man he met called himself John. That is the documented structure of the encounter, and it is important to stay with that structure. A ransom intermediary, a cemetery, an alias, a child still missing, a family under unbearable pressure. Investigators trying to follow a trail that kept shifting between paper, place, and performance. Woodlawn Cemetery was not a police station. It was not the Lindbergh estate near Hopewell. It was not a bank, a courthouse, or a newspaper office. It was a large public burial ground in the Bronx, a place where movement could be both visible and hard to interpret. People could enter and leave without, by that fact alone, appearing out of place. Paths, monuments, trees, and distance could divide one person from another. The choice of such a setting gave the meeting an eerie procedural logic. It was public enough to be accessible, private enough to support concealment, and symbolically heavy in a case where everyone still hoped the missing child might be alive. By March 12th, the investigation had already become something larger than a normal police response to a local crime. The New Jersey State Police had assumed charge after Hopewell police were notified. The FBI, through Director J. Edgar Hoover, had offered assistance to New Jersey State Police Superintendent H. Norman Schwarzkopf, though at that stage, the Bureau's role remained auxiliary because there was no federal jurisdiction. The physical case had begun in New Jersey. The second-floor nursery, the windowsill, mud traces, footprints that could not be measured, and the homemade ladder associated with the abduction. The written case had begun with the first ransom note, demanding $50,000, and then moved outward with a second note, postmarked Brooklyn, New York, on March 4th, received by Charles Lindbergh on March 6th, raising the demand to $70,000. Now the case crossed into another register. The person who had written, or who was connected to those who wrote, did not simply send instructions. He arranged contact. He asked the visible world to come to him on terms he controlled. Condon's role made the encounter possible. He was not the child's father. He was not a police commander. He was not, at that point, a courtroom witness looking backward on completed events. He was a living part of the ransom machinery as it was still operating. His public offer had created a channel, and that channel now carried him to Woodlawn Cemetery. The code name, Jafsie, had given him an identity within the negotiation, one that could be recognized by the other side without using the ordinary forms of official authority. The man who appeared under the name John also used identity as a tool. The notes identify him not by a verified name, but as a man calling himself John. That phrasing matters. It marks the uncertainty at the center of the meeting. He presented a name, but the name did not settle who he was. It allowed communication while preserving concealment. In a case already shaped by disguise, distance, and written demands, the alias became another layer between the crime and the person behind it. There is a temptation in retelling this scene to fill the cemetery with imagined words, but the power of the meeting does not depend on invented dialogue. Its significance lies in the documented arrangement itself. The Lindbergh child had been taken from a rural home in New Jersey. Ransom demands had arrived through written messages. A retired school principal had stepped forward through a newspaper. And now, in a Bronx cemetery, that intermediary met a man who would not give his real identity, while law enforcement and the family remained bound to the central fact that the child had not been recovered. The meeting shows how the ransom process created its own geography. The case no longer belonged to one location. Hopewell remained the origin point, the place of the nursery window and the ladder. Brooklyn had entered the record through the postmark on the second ransom note. The Bronx now became a stage for direct contact. Each new place carried the investigation farther from the child's bedroom and deeper into a maze of controlled communications. That geography also reveals the imbalance of power. The family and investigators had to respond to messages. They had to consider instructions. They had to follow leads that might be genuine, false, partial, or designed only to create delay. The person on the hidden side of the exchange could choose when to appear, what name to use, where contact would occur, and what information would be given. The visible side had urgency, but limited control. The hidden side had uncertainty as a weapon. Condon's presence at Woodlawn Cemetery therefore represents more than an odd episode. It shows the ransom negotiation as a staged process. The case unfolded not as a straight line from crime to suspect, but as a series of contacts that required interpretation. A note on a windowsill, a postmarked letter, a public offer in the Bronx Home News, a code name, a cemetery meeting. Each step had to be treated as both message and possible evidence. For investigators, such contacts were valuable and dangerous at the same time. A meeting could produce a description, a memory, a pattern, a route, or some detail that might later be compared with other evidence. But it could also pull attention away from the physical clues already gathered. It could invite confusion. It could create witnesses whose recollections would later be tested under enormous pressure. Condon's later identification would become one piece of the prosecution's circumstantial case against Bruno Richard Hauptmann. But on March 12, 1932, that future courtroom role was not yet fixed. Condon was still in the middle of an active attempt to reach a missing child. The cemetery meeting also belongs to the larger story of public pressure. The Lindbergh kidnapping was not unfolding in quiet isolation. Charles A. Lindbergh was one of the most famous Americans of his time, and the disappearance of his 20-month-old son had drawn national attention almost immediately. Newspapers, public appeals, law enforcement agencies, and private intermediaries all became part of the same atmosphere. In that atmosphere, every message could seem urgent, every contact potentially decisive, and every delay unbearable. That pressure helps create the conditions in which an intermediary like Condon could matter. The case had opened space for unusual actors because the normal boundaries between private grief, police work, and public communication had already been strained. A man with no original official role could become central because he had access to a channel the other side appeared willing to use. His credibility came not from a badge, but from the fact that contact continued through him. Woodlawn Cemetery, then, was not simply a dramatic location. It was a working site in the ransom system. It allowed the hidden party to test the intermediary. It allowed the negotiation to move from written demands toward personal contact without surrendering anonymity. It demonstrated that the case would be conducted through signals and staged appearances as much as through conventional investigation. The word John in this encounter carries that cold simplicity. It is common, nearly blank, useful because it reveals little. Paired with Jafsie, it creates a strange mirror. One name invented for a public go-between. One name offered by a concealed man. Neither name, by itself, solved anything. But together they became part of the record, part of the chain by which the ransom trail would later be reconstructed. At the center of all this remained the absence of Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. The cemetery meeting did not return him. It did not end the investigation. It did not resolve whether the ransom demands were the work of one person or more than one. What it did was deepen the structure of the case. The child missing, the family waiting, the public watching, the police searching, and the ransom process advancing according to rules set by someone outside official reach. That is why the meeting still feels so stark in the archive. It is not because of a speech we can safely recreate, or because the scene needs embellishment. It is because the facts themselves are severe. On March 12th, a retired Bronx school principal serving as Jafsie went to Woodlawn Cemetery near 233rd Street and Jerome Avenue. There he met a man calling himself John. The encounter became one of the early face-to-face moments in a case otherwise dominated by distance. The distance from the nursery to the ground below, from Hopewell to Brooklyn, from written threats to human voices, from public hope to private fear. After Woodlawn, the ransom path did not become clearer. It became more consequential. The machinery that had produced notes and a cemetery meeting would soon lead to money changing hands. Marked bills would enter the story not as an abstract plan, but as physical currency passed through a desperate exchange. Instructions would point toward a boat called Nellie near Martha's Vineyard, and hope would again be directed toward a named place. The pattern established at Woodlawn would continue: contact, instruction, movement, uncertainty. And each step would leave behind something investigators could later try to trace. After Woodlawn, the case entered a colder kind of motion. The meeting in the cemetery had shown that the ransom trail could produce contact, but not certainty. It could produce a man with an alias, a location chosen away from ordinary life, and a procedure that seemed designed to keep everyone else reacting. What it had not produced was the return of Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. By early April, the logic of the exchange had narrowed. The Lindbergh family, the police, and Dr. John F. Condon were all operating inside a system created by the ransom demands. The unseen writer, or writers, controlled the timing. They controlled the instructions. They controlled the promise that money could be converted into a child's safe return. For the family, that promise was not an abstraction. It was the only point toward which the ordeal could be directed. On April 2nd, 1932, Condon handed over $50,000 in ransom money. That sentence in the archive carries a stark simplicity. It does not carry the weight that the moment must have held for those involved. $50,000 was the amount demanded in the first ransom note found on the nursery windowsill. It was also the amount that would now become physical evidence, bills prepared not only to satisfy a demand, but to leave a trail if the exchange failed. In a case built so far on uncertain footprints, a homemade ladder, handwriting, and staged contacts, the ransom money became something different. It was ordinary currency turned into an investigative instrument. The exchange itself was cruel in its mechanics. Money moved from the side of the victim's family toward the side of the abductor. In return came not the child, but directions. Condon received instructions, claiming that the child could be found on a boat named Nellie near Martha's Vineyard. The name mattered because it gave shape to hope. A boat was specific. Nellie was specific. Martha's Vineyard was specific. After weeks of notes, aliases, and controlled contact, the directions appeared to point toward a recoverable place. A search could be mounted. A map could be followed. The promise of the ransom demand could finally be tested against the physical world. But the search near Martha's Vineyard was unsuccessful. That failure was not merely a failed lead. It was a demonstration of the power imbalance at the center of the crime. The person controlling the ransom channel could give a location, and every other participant had to respond as if the location might be true. To ignore it would be unthinkable. To follow it meant time, effort, fear, and renewed public anxiety. The named boat became part of the emotional machinery of the case, a detail precise enough to compel action, but, as it turned out, not precise enough to produce the child. The boat called Nellie stands in the record as one of the most punishing false destinations in the Lindbergh Kidnapping. It directed attention away from the estate near Hopewell, away from the Bronx Cemetery, away from the known facts, and toward the waters near Martha's Vineyard. It transformed the ransom payment into a moment of suspended belief. The child might be there. The instructions might be real. The exchange might still end in recovery. Instead, it deepened the uncertainty. For investigators, April 2nd also marked the point at which the ransom money became central in a new way. Before the payment, the bills were potential leverage. After the payment, they were evidence in circulation. Authorities had prepared for this possibility by recording and distributing the serial numbers of ransom bills. Banks and businesses were alerted through serial number information, and the later search for marked gold certificates became one of the most important mechanisms in the investigation. This was slow evidence. It did not work like an eyewitness seeing a face at the scene. It did not work like a confession. It depended on time, on commerce, on ordinary transactions, and on the chance that a marked bill would surface somewhere visible. A person could avoid a crime scene. A person could use an alias. A person could write notes without appearing in public. But money, once spent, entered systems watched by other people: bank tellers, shopkeepers, clerks, attendants, institutions trained to notice the numbers that had been distributed. In that sense, the ransom drop created two trails at once. One trail led immediately toward Nellie, toward Martha's Vineyard, toward the search that failed. The other trail moved more quietly through the economy. It passed into pockets, drawers, counters, registers, and banks. It might disappear for a time, but it carried identifiers. The ransom money had been made to remember where it came from. The public drama of the case often centered on visible scenes: the nursery window, the ladder, the cemetery, the search near the named boat. But the marked bills belonged to a different kind of investigation, one that depended on records rather than spectacle. A serial number is not dramatic in itself. It has no emotional force unless someone is looking for it. But in this case, serial numbers turned currency into a map of possible contact. Every marked bill that appeared could become a sign that the ransom had moved through a particular hand, a particular neighborhood, a particular business. That is why April 2nd remained important long after the Martha's Vineyard search failed. The handover did not recover the child, but it changed the evidentiary future of the case. The money could still speak later, if found. And years later, the search for marked gold certificates would become central to locating a suspect. A suspicious $10 gold certificate used at a gasoline station at 127th Street and Lexington Avenue in New York City would draw attention because the ransom list existed. The attendant's recording of a car's license number would matter because the money had already been marked and tracked. That later chain would lead to Bruno Richard Hauptmann of East 222nd Street in the Bronx, and more than $13,000 in ransom certificates would be discovered in his garage after his arrest. But on April 2nd, 1932, none of that future had yet unfolded. The investigators did not yet have a suspect in custody. The trial in Flemington was still years away. The wood evidence, handwriting comparisons, witness identifications, and courtroom arguments had not yet become the architecture of a prosecution. What existed in that moment was simpler and more devastating. A family had paid, an intermediary had carried out the transaction, instructions had been received, and the promised recovery had not happened. Condon's role in this moment also became fixed more deeply into the case. He was no longer only the retired Bronx school principal who had entered through the Bronx Home News under the code name Jafsie. He had become the person who handled the ransom exchange itself. That made him a participant in the chain of events, not merely an observer. His contact with the man calling himself John, his role as intermediary, and his later identification would become part of the circumstantial case that prosecutors built. But at this stage, his importance was immediate and practical. He was the human channel through which money passed and instructions returned. The cruelty of the ransom drop lay in how orderly it was. A demand had been made. A go-between had been established. A payment was delivered. A destination was named. Each step resembled a procedure, and procedure suggests that if the correct action is taken, the promised result may follow. But kidnapping destroys that trust. The victim's side can follow every instruction and still be left with nothing but another location to search, another possibility exhausted, another set of facts that do not bring the child home. The search near Martha's Vineyard did not resolve the case. It exposed the ransom system for what it had become, a method of command. The abductor, or abductors, could turn the nation's attention toward a boat that did not yield the child. They could move hope across state lines and over water. They could force investigators and family representatives to act on information that might be true, because the cost of dismissing it was too great. And yet, within that failure, the investigation gained one of its most durable tools. The marked ransom money was now out in the world. It had left the controlled side of the exchange. It could be spent, saved, hidden, passed, or deposited. But wherever it went, it carried numbers that had been recorded before the drop. The money had become a witness of a particular kind, silent, transferable, and difficult to erase completely. For the Lindbergh family, April 2nd did not bring the ending they needed. For law enforcement, it marked a turn from ransom negotiation toward a longer and more patient form of pursuit. The boat called Nellie had offered a name and a place, but no child. The ransom bills, by contrast, offered no comfort at all in the moment, only the possibility that someday, somewhere, one of them might reappear. The case had begun at a nursery window near Hopewell. It had moved through handwritten demands, a Bronx newspaper, a cemetery meeting, and now a failed search near Martha's Vineyard. Each stage widened the geography of the crime, but none yet answered the central question. Through April, the child remained missing. The hope attached to the ransom exchange had been spent along with the money. What came after was not another instruction leading to rescue. It was a discovery much closer to the Lindbergh home near Mount Rose, New Jersey, in Mercer County. There, the search for a living child would give way to the grim work of identification, distance, and cause of death. After the failed search near Martha's Vineyard, the case no longer moved with the same kind of hope. The boat called Nellie had been a promised place, a name attached to the possibility of recovery. But the promise had led nowhere. The ransom money was gone. The child was still missing. And by May, the geography of the investigation had stretched from rural New Jersey to the Bronx to Massachusetts, while the answer that mattered most remained hidden. Then, on May 12, 1932, the case turned back toward the Lindbergh home. The discovery came not from a ransom instruction, not from a planned police search, and not from a dramatic confrontation. According to the FBI's summary of the case, the child's body was found near Mount Rose, New Jersey, in Mercer County, about 4.5 miles southeast of the Lindbergh residence. The FBI notes identify the discoverers as William Allen, an assistant on a truck driven by Orville Wilson. The body was approximately 45 feet from a highway. Those details are stark because they reduce the scene to distance, chance, and proximity. 4.5 miles from the home. 45 feet from a highway. Near Mount Rose, in the same county as the Lindbergh estate. After all the letters, aliases, directions, and distance searches, the body was found not at sea, not aboard a boat, not in the place named by the ransom trail, but close to where the abduction had begun. For investigators, the location mattered immediately. It placed the endpoint of the child's disappearance within a narrow physical world around the home near Hopewell. The earlier stages of the case had created movement across maps. A second ransom note postmarked Brooklyn, a Bronx intermediary, Woodlawn Cemetery, Martha's Vineyard. But Mount Rose was different. It pulled attention back to Mercer County and to the rural roads around the Lindbergh property. It suggested that, whatever elaborate communications had followed, the child may never have been taken far from the original scene. For the family, the discovery ended one uncertainty and deepened another. Until that day, the crime was still officially a kidnapping, with the hope, however fragile, of return. The ransom exchange had depended on that hope. The instructions about Nellie had exploited it. Every contact from the supposed kidnappers had implied that the child was alive, or at least recoverable. The discovery near Mount Rose destroyed that structure. From this point forward, the case was no longer only about abduction and extortion. It was about death. The body was identified as Charles Lindbergh Jr., the child who had been taken from the second-floor nursery on March 1, 1932, was no longer missing. He had been found in Mercer County, not far from the home where the first ransom note had been left on the nursery windowsill. The FBI summary records that the body was cremated in Trenton, New Jersey, on May 13, 1932. That date sits beside another important development in the investigation, because May 13th also became the day President Herbert Hoover directed federal investigative agencies to assist New Jersey. But before the case became a broader federal matter, there was the immediate work of identification and examination. The coroner's examination, as summarized by the FBI, concluded that the child had been dead for about 2 months. The examination also concluded that the cause of death was a blow to the head. That finding changed how the earlier timeline looked. The child had been taken on March 1st. If he had been dead for about 2 months when found on May 12th, then the death was placed close to the time of the kidnapping itself. The ransom trail, the notes, the increased demand, the cemetery meeting, the payment, and the directions to the boat called Nellie had all unfolded while, according to the coroner's conclusion, summarized by the FBI, the child had likely already been dead. This is one of the most devastating procedural turns in the case. The ransom negotiations had created a theater of possibility. Each written demand had implied control. Each instruction had forced movement. Each contact had kept the family, police, and public oriented toward the idea of recovery. But the medical conclusion suggested that this entire period may have been built over an absence already fixed at the beginning. In a quieter sense, the finding also sharpened the meaning of the physical evidence from the first night. The nursery window, the mud traces, the unclear footprints, and the homemade ladder were no longer only signs of entry and escape. They became part of a possible death sequence. The ladder had already been treated as a major object in the investigation, a tool used to reach the nursery, a fragile construction with one section split or broken where it joined another. After Mount Rose, the ladder's meaning grew darker. It was not simply associated with removing the child from the room. It was associated with the first movements in a crime that ended in a fatal injury. The record summarized in the notes does not require speculation to show why this mattered. A body found about 4.5 miles from the home, about 45 feet from a highway, after a ransom exchange and failed recovery instructions forced investigators to separate performance from evidence. The performance had been the ransom trail: notes, demands, aliases, directions. The evidence now included a body, a cause of death, and a location near the original scene. For the public, the discovery transformed the emotional shape of the case. Newspapers and newsreels had already made the kidnapping a national story because of who the child's parents were. Charles A. Lindbergh was not an ordinary private citizen in the public imagination. He was one of the most famous Americans of his era, and the crime against his family had become a shared national drama. But the discovery near Mount Rose removed the final space in which the public could imagine a rescue. The story became not a suspense of return, but a murder investigation under national observation. That national observation is part of what made the Lindbergh case so consequential. Long before the trial in Flemington, long before courtroom coverage raised questions about cameras, radio, and the limits of press access, the investigation itself had already become a public event. The discovery of the body intensified that condition. It gave the case a grief that could not be managed privately because the public had already been invited into every stage of uncertainty. The child's disappearance had been treated as news almost from the beginning. The ransom negotiations had created public fascination and fear. The finding near Mount Rose made the loss final in front of the country. At the same time, the investigative challenge became more complex. The body confirmed death, but it did not by itself identify the person responsible. The ransom money was still out in circulation. The note still had to be studied. The ladder still had to be understood. The contacts through Jafsie still had to be weighed. The case was no longer a search for the child, but it remained a search for the kidnapper or kidnappers. This distinction mattered for law enforcement. The New Jersey State Police had assumed charge early after Hopewell police were notified, and Superintendent H. Norman Schwarzkopf's force remained central to the investigation. But the scale of the case had never been purely local in public terms. By May, its emotional reach was national, while its legal structure still depended on jurisdiction. The FBI had offered assistance on March 2, 1932, through Director J. Edgar Hoover, but at first, the Bureau could act only in an auxiliary capacity because there was no federal jurisdiction over the kidnapping itself. The body near Mount Rose exposed that tension more clearly. The crime had taken place in New Jersey. The investigation was led by New Jersey authorities. Yet the consequences had spread far beyond the state. Ransom communications had crossed city and state lines. Public pressure had become national. Financial tracing would require banks, businesses, and serial number awareness across a broad network. The case was becoming larger than the legal tools available at the start. May 13th, the day after the body was found, and the day of the cremation in Trenton, marked a further shift. President Herbert Hoover directed federal investigative agencies to assist New Jersey. From that point, the federal role would be more organized, with the FBI serving as a clearinghouse and coordinating agency for federal investigative work. The discovery near Mount Rose, then, was not only the moment when the family's worst fear was confirmed, it was also the moment when the case changed form. The search for a living child ended. The investigation into a murder deepened, and the pressure on institutions grew. What had begun at a nursery window had become a test of police coordination, federal authority, public attention, and the law itself. By the time the body was identified and cremated in Trenton, the Lindbergh case had already outgrown the shape of an ordinary local investigation. The first hours had belonged to the immediate scene near Hopewell, the nursery, the window, the ladder, the mud, the note. Then the case had moved through postmarks, intermediaries, cemetery meetings, ransom instructions, and a false lead toward Martha's Vineyard. But after May 12th and May 13th, 1932, the pressure changed. The question was no longer only how to recover a missing child. It was how to pursue a murder case that had crossed boundaries before the law had fully decided who could follow it. At the beginning, the formal command rested with the New Jersey State Police. After Hopewell police were notified, the state police assumed charge, and the investigation proceeded under Superintendent H. Norman Schwarzkopf. That detail matters because it places the early case inside a state framework. The crime had occurred in New Jersey, at the Lindbergh home near Hopewell. The body, when found, was also in New Jersey, near Mount Rose in Mercer County, about 4.5 miles southeast of the home. The central physical evidence was tied to that landscape: the nursery window, the homemade ladder, the traces beneath the window, and later, the place where the child was discovered. But from the start, the case did not behave like a crime confined to one jurisdiction. The second ransom note was postmarked Brooklyn, New York. Dr. John F. Condon entered the case from the Bronx after publishing his offer in the Bronx Home News. The cemetery meeting took place at Woodlawn Cemetery near 233rd Street and Jerome Avenue. The ransom exchange on April 2nd moved through New York channels and pointed investigators toward a boat supposedly near Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. The facts kept spreading outward. The legal authority, however, did not automatically spread with them. On March 2nd, 1932, the day after the kidnapping, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover offered assistance to Superintendent H. Norman Schwarzkopf. It was an important offer, but it was also a limited one. At that stage, the FBI did not simply take over. According to the FBI's own summary, the Bureau initially acted only in an auxiliary capacity because there was no federal jurisdiction over the case. That phrase, auxiliary capacity, is quiet, but it carries the institutional tension of the moment. The kidnapping of Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was already a national event in the newspapers and in public feeling. The father was Charles A. Lindbergh, one of the most famous Americans of the time. The crime touched celebrity, family terror, and the fear that a child could be taken from a private home. Yet notoriety did not itself create federal jurisdiction. Public attention could move faster than the law. In the early months of the case, that gap mattered. New Jersey led, and outside agencies could assist, but the federal government's role had to be framed carefully. The FBI could offer technical help, collect information, and lend support, but it did not yet have the statutory authority that later generations would associate with major interstate kidnapping investigations. The machinery of federal law enforcement was present, but not fully empowered. The Lindbergh case exposed that limitation in a dramatic way. The crime began in a rural New Jersey house, but the ransom trail moved through New York. Communications crossed state lines. Instructions directed searchers beyond New Jersey. Money, once paid, could circulate anywhere. The investigation required not just local knowledge, but banks, businesses, postal information, police communication, and coordination across jurisdictions. The case showed how a single crime could produce a national investigative problem while still sitting inside older legal boundaries. Then came May 13th, 1932. It was the day the child's body was cremated in Trenton. It was also the day President Herbert Hoover directed federal investigative agencies to assist New Jersey. From that point, the federal role became more organized. The FBI served as a clearinghouse and coordinating agency for federal investigative work. A clearinghouse is not the same as a dramatic raid or an arrest. It is quieter than that. It means information moves through a central point. Reports can be received, compared, sorted, and redirected. Leads from different agencies can be placed into relation with one another. In a case like this, where the ransom trail involved notes, meetings, marked currency, and locations beyond New Jersey, coordination became its own form of power. The shift did not erase the New Jersey State Police role. Superintendent Schwarzkopf and the state police remained central to the investigation. But the president's directive acknowledged that the case had reached a level where federal agencies needed to assist in a structured way. The investigation was no longer only a state effort, supported by occasional federal help. It was becoming a coordinated law enforcement operation shaped by national attention and national pressure. The timing is significant. The directive came one day after the discovery near Mount Rose. Until then, the official hope of recovery, however fragile, had still existed in the structure of the case. After the body was found, the crime became more clearly fixed as a murder investigation. The public grief deepened. The demand for answers sharpened. And the federal government's involvement became part of the answer to a larger question. What should happen when a crime shocks the nation but begins beyond the reach of existing federal criminal law? The answer would not be only investigative. It would also be legislative. The Lindbergh Kidnapping contributed to the passage of the Federal Kidnapping Act, widely known as the Lindbergh Law. Its central purpose was to make kidnapping involving interstate transportation a federal offense. In plain terms, it gave the federal government a legal basis to intervene when a kidnapped person was transported across state lines. The law responded to a practical problem the case had made impossible to ignore. Kidnappers could exploit the borders between states, while investigators and prosecutors were often constrained by them. The name Lindbergh Law shows how closely the statute became associated with this one crime. The kidnapping had turned private tragedy into public policy pressure. It had shown the limits of a system built around local and state jurisdiction when criminals, communications, and money could move through a wider map. A nursery in New Jersey, a postmark from Brooklyn, a cemetery in the Bronx, a false instruction toward Martha's Vineyard, and a national press following every development. Together, these elements made the old boundaries look inadequate. That is part of why the case belongs in the history of crime and power. Power here was not only the power of the kidnapper to command attention through ransom notes. It was also the power of fame to attract institutions, the power of newspapers to turn investigation into spectacle, and the power of a notorious crime to change the law. The Lindbergh family's grief became entwined with questions of federal reach, police authority, and the public demand for protection. There is a danger, in looking back, of treating federal involvement as inevitable. But in March of 1932, it was not inevitable in the legal sense. J. Edgar Hoover could offer help, but the Bureau's role was limited. By May 13th, after the President's directive, federal participation was more organized, yet still built around assistance and coordination. The broader statutory change came through the Lindbergh Law, which addressed the jurisdictional weakness revealed by the case. The result was a new structure around a new fear. Kidnapping was not new, but the Lindbergh case gave it a national face. It suggested that even a guarded, famous, rural home could be penetrated, that ransom negotiations could move through newspapers, aliases, and distant instructions, and that a child taken from one state might lead investigators into another before the law had caught up. The Federal Kidnapping Act was part of that catching up. Still, law and coordination did not solve the case immediately. After May 1932, the investigation continued without a suspect in custody. The clearinghouse could organize information, and federal agencies could assist New Jersey, but the trail remained difficult. The ransom drop had already happened. The promised boat had been false. The child had been found dead. What remained were traces. Some traces were physical, like the latter. Some were written, like the ransom notes, and some were financial. the ransom bills that had passed from Condon's hands into the darkness on April 2nd. Those bills carried serial numbers. Their movement could be watched, slowly, unevenly, through banks and businesses. The search would become less about a single dramatic scene and more about patient recognition, one certificate at a time. The institutional structure had expanded. The law was changing. Federal pressure had entered the case. But the next break would come from something small enough to pass across a counter, marked money, still circulating, still capable of speaking long after the ransom exchange had failed. By the time federal coordination had entered the Lindbergh investigation, the case had become a search through many kinds of traces. The latter could be examined. The ransom notes could be compared. Witnesses could be questioned and re-questioned. But the money had a different quality. It was not fixed in one place. It moved. The ransom money had been handed over on April 2nd, 1932, when Dr. John F. Condon, the Bronx intermediary known as Jafsie, delivered $50,000 and received directions to a boat called Nellie near Martha's Vineyard. The directions failed. The child was not found there. But the money did not disappear in the same way. It entered circulation. It could pass from hand to hand, from pocket to cash drawer, from a counter to a bank deposit. And because the bills had been recorded, each one carried a quiet mark of identity. This was the investigative life of the ransom money. Authorities distributed the serial numbers of the ransom bills to banks and businesses. The mechanism was simple in concept and difficult in practice. A list of numbers had to meet the ordinary speed of commerce. Clerks, tellers, merchants, and attendants had to notice what most people did not notice: the printed identity of a bill. In the early phase of the case, the public drama had been concentrated around visible scenes: the nursery window near Hopewell, the homemade ladder, the cemetery meeting in the Bronx, the ransom drop, the failed search near Martha's Vineyard. Now, the investigation also depended on something quieter and more repetitive: the act of looking closely at money. The search centered especially on marked gold certificates. These certificates were ordinary enough to pass across a counter, but extraordinary in the context of this case because their serial numbers had been preserved. They were small objects with a memory attached to them. A bill could not explain who had carried it. It could not say where it had been hidden, or who had spent it first, or how many hands had touched it after the ransom exchange. But it could prove one important fact: that a piece of the ransom had survived into the present and had appeared at a particular place and time. That was the power of marked money. It did not need to tell the whole story. It only needed to reopen the trail. For more than 2 years after the ransom drop, that trail remained slow and uneven. The Lindbergh case had not faded from public awareness, but public attention and investigative progress are not the same thing. Newspapers could keep a story alive. Institutions could coordinate files and tips. Federal agencies could assist, gather, and compare. But a single usable break still required contact between evidence and routine life. Someone had to spend a bill. Someone else had to recognize it. In this sense, the ransom money became a test of patience. The investigation had to wait for movement. A certificate hidden away was silent. A certificate put into circulation became visible. The very act of spending could create a trace. On September 15, 1934, that kind of trace appeared in New York City. A suspicious $10 gold certificate was used at a gasoline station at 127th Street and Lexington Avenue. The amount was small. The place was ordinary. A gasoline station was not a courtroom, not a police barracks, not a federal office, not the rural New Jersey estate where the case had begun. It was a place of routine exchange, where vehicles stopped, money changed hands, and customers moved on. But this ordinary setting is precisely why the moment mattered. The marked bill had surfaced in daily commerce, and this time someone noticed. The attendant recorded the car's license number. That act was modest, almost clerical. It did not solve the case by itself. It did not prove a kidnapping or a murder, or even that the person who passed the bill had been present at the ransom drop. But it preserved the connection that money alone could not preserve. The bill had a serial number. The car had a license number. Together, they created a path from a piece of currency to a vehicle, and from a vehicle toward a person who could be located. The investigation had always needed this kind of bridge. The ransom notes could be studied for handwriting. The latter could be studied for wood, tool marks, nail hole patterns, and construction. The cemetery meeting gave Dr. Condon a man who called himself John. But each category of evidence had its own limits. Handwriting comparisons depended on interpretation. Wood evidence would later require expert analysis. A witness identification depended on memory across time. The money was different. It was numerical. It was trackable. It could move from a list to a cash drawer to a license plate. That is why the marked certificate at 127th Street and Lexington Avenue carried such investigative force. It linked the long-ago ransom payment to a specific moment more than 2 years later. In the case's chronology, the bill seemed almost to come back from the past. It belonged to April 2nd, 1932, the night of the ransom exchange. But it appeared again on September 15th, 1934, in the hands of someone buying gasoline in New York City. The distance between those dates matters porend. By then, the child had been found dead near Mount Rose. The original hope of recovery had ended. The investigation had expanded beyond its first local form. Federal agencies had been brought into a larger coordinating structure. The Lindbergh Law had reflected the national pressure created by the case. Yet the practical search for a suspect still depended on evidence that could be followed. The bill did what the false directions to the Nellie had not done. It led somewhere. There is also a larger meaning in the fact that the break came through commerce. The Lindbergh Kidnapping had become a national spectacle because of fame, fear, and the power of the press. But this crucial moment was not theatrical. It was not a confession. It was not a dramatic raid. It was a transaction. A gold certificate crossed a counter. An attendant became alert to its significance. A license number was written down. The machinery of the investigation, which had waited so long for a usable trace, finally had something narrow enough to follow. In true crime stories, evidence is often imagined as something left behind at the scene. A footprint, a tool, a strand, a note. The Lindbergh case had those elements such as. But the ransom money shows another kind of evidence. Evidence that is not left behind, but carried forward. It travels. It hides inside ordinary life. It can look unimportant until the right eyes read it correctly. The marked $10 gold certificate did not stand apart from the larger investigation. It belonged to the same chain that began with the ransom demand for $50,000, continued through Condon's role as intermediary, and passed through the failed promise of the boat near Martha's Vineyard. But by September of 1934, the money had become more than a remnant of the ransom. It had become an active witness. Still, the bill could only begin the next movement. It identified itself as part of the ransom. The license number connected the transaction to a car. From there, authorities could trace the registration and move from currency to address, from a small marked object to a named suspect. The long trail from the nursery window had narrowed to a single gold certificate used for gasoline in New York City. And from that small object, the investigation now moved toward Bruno Richard Hauptmann of 1279 East 222nd Street in the Bronx. The license number did what the marked certificate alone could not do. The bill had announced that ransom money was still moving through ordinary life. The number written down at the gasoline station gave that movement a direction. It turned a moment at a counter into a traceable record. From the gasoline station at 127th Street and Lexington Avenue, authorities followed the registration trail to a name and an address, Bruno Richard Hauptmann, 1279 East 222nd Street in the Bronx. By then, the Lindbergh investigation had lived for more than 2 years inside uncertainty. It had moved from Hopewell to the Bronx, from the nursery window to Woodlawn Cemetery, from ransom notes to marked bills, from New Jersey roads to New York businesses. The case had become large enough to involve state police, federal coordination, banks, commercial institutions, and the watchfulness of clerks and attendants. But in September of 1934, the path narrowed sharply. A suspicious $10 gold certificate had been used for gasoline. An attendant had recorded a license number. That number led to Hauptmann. The chain mattered because it was practical. It did not depend on rumor or atmosphere. It did not begin with a confession. It began with a piece of currency already identified by its serial number as part of the Lindbergh ransom. The authorities had distributed those serial numbers to banks and businesses because the money, unlike many other clues, might reappear. A ladder could remain in evidence. A note could sit in a file, but ransom money could circulate. It could be spent months or years later, and each transaction carried the chance of recognition. That is what happened on September 15, 1934. A gold certificate connected to the ransom appeared in New York City. The location was specific, 127th Street and Lexington Avenue. The transaction was ordinary, gasoline. The action that made it extraordinary was the attendant's decision to record the car's license number. In the logic of the investigation, this small act was decisive. It joined the bill to a vehicle. The vehicle registration then joined the transaction to a person. Bruno Richard Hauptmann, identified in the FBI summary as a German-born carpenter and a native of Saxony, Germany, was no longer simply an unknown figure somewhere beyond the ransom trail. He had an address. He could be found. The investigation, which had been stretched across institutions and jurisdictions, now converged on the Bronx. Hauptmann was arrested on September 19, 1934. The date marks one of the clearest turning points in the case. Before the arrest, the Lindbergh investigation was a search for someone hidden behind aliases, handwriting, ransom instructions, and the anonymous movement of money. After the arrest, it became a case against a named man. The public story also changed. For more than 2 years, newspapers and officials had followed fragments: the nursery scene, the ladder, the ransom notes, the cemetery meeting, the failed directions to the boat called Nellie, the discovery near Mount Rose, and then the slow search through marked currency. Now there was a suspect whose name could be printed, whose address could be reported, and whose background could be examined. The arrest did not end the matter. It opened a new phase. The strongest immediate development came after authorities searched and found more than $13,000 in ransom certificates in Hauptmann's garage. That discovery shifted the meaning of the gasoline station certificate. The $10 gold certificate had been the point of contact. The money found in the garage suggested a larger connection to the ransom fund. What had first appeared as a single marked bill used in a single transaction now belonged to a wider cache of certificates tied to the original ransom. The garage became important because it joined place, possession, and documented currency. The ransom money had not merely passed briefly through Hauptmann's hands in an unexplained transaction. According to the documented chain, more than $13,000 in ransom certificates was discovered in his garage after his arrest. In a case that would later depend heavily on circumstantial evidence, that fact carried great weight. It was concrete, countable, and connected to the serial number system put in place after the ransom payment. The money also linked the arrest back to the earlier decisions made by investigators. When the ransom was paid on April 2, 1932, the bills were not just cash. They were instruments of investigation. Their serial numbers had been recorded and circulated. That preparation allowed the authorities, more than 2 years later, to recognize a gold certificate at a gasoline station. Without that system, the certificate might have been only currency. With it, the bill became evidence. The arrest of Hauptmann also brought jurisdiction into sharper focus. The Lindbergh kidnapping had always crossed boundaries in practical ways, even before the law fully caught up. The child was taken from New Jersey. Ransom communications and meetings drew the case into New York. Dr. John F. Condon, the go-between known as Jafsie, operated from the Bronx. The cemetery meeting occurred at Woodlawn Cemetery, near 233rd Street and Jerome Avenue. The marked money surfaced in New York City. Hauptmann lived in the Bronx, but the body had been found near Mount Rose, New Jersey, in Mercer County, and the original abduction had taken place at the Lindbergh home near Hopewell. Those overlapping places shaped the legal response after the arrest. Hauptmann was indicted in Bronx County, New York, for extortion on September 26, 1934. Less than 2 weeks later, he was indicted in Hunterdon County, New Jersey, for murder on October 8, 1934. The two indictments reflected two parts of the larger case. In New York, the focus was extortion, tied to the ransom demand and the money trail. In New Jersey, the charge was murder, tied to the death of Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. and the state where the crime began. This sequence shows how the case moved from investigation to prosecution. The marked certificate did not by itself answer every question. The license number did not by itself prove the whole crime. The address did not by itself establish guilt. The money in the garage did not stand alone as the entire case. But together, these elements formed the beginning of a prosecutorial structure. A gold certificate led to a license number. A license number led to an address. An address led to Bruno Richard Hauptmann. An arrest led to a search. The search led to more than $13,000 in ransom certificates. That is the documented chain at the center of this chapter. Its power lies in its plainness. It is not a dramatic chase through the streets. It is not a sudden eyewitness revelation. It is an investigative sequence built from records, currency, and follow-through. The case had become famous because of the Lindbergh name, because of the terror of a child taken from a nursery, and because newspapers and the public followed every turn. But the arrest itself came through something quieter, a marked bill recognized in circulation, and a number written down before the moment disappeared. For authorities, Hauptmann's arrest created the possibility of organizing the fragments that had accumulated since March 1st, 1932. The ransom notes could be compared. The roll of Condon could be revisited. The latter could be examined against tools and wood. The money could be placed inside a larger evidentiary pattern. Each item had existed before, but now prosecutors could begin to argue that these objects and memories pointed toward one defendant. That movement from trace to argument would define the next phase. The case against Hauptmann would not rest on a single direct proof visible to everyone in the same way. It would be built as a network. Ransom certificates, handwriting evidence, Condon's identification, tool marks, and wood evidence from the latter. The arrest made that network possible. It gave the investigation a defendant, and with him, a courtroom future in which objects would be asked to speak. With Hauptmann under arrest, the investigation entered a different kind of work. Before September of 1934, many clues had existed as separate trails: the ransom notes, the cemetery meetings, the marked money, the ladder from the Lindbergh estate, the memories of witnesses who had seen or heard pieces of the story. After the arrest, those trails could be arranged around a single defendant. The question was no longer only where the money had gone, or who had written the notes, or how the nursery window had been reached. The question became whether all of those fragments, taken together, could prove that Bruno Richard Hauptmann was the man responsible. That distinction mattered because the case prosecutors prepared was largely circumstantial. In public language, circumstantial evidence is sometimes treated as weaker than direct proof, as if it is merely a collection of hints. But in a courtroom, circumstantial evidence can operate differently. It can form a structure. One fact may not decide the case by itself, but it may support another fact. A physical object may make a witness's memory more important. A written note may become more meaningful when compared with other writings. A piece of wood may seem ordinary until it is placed beside a tool, a home, and a ladder connected to a crime scene. The prosecution's case against Hauptmann would be built in that manner. It did not rest on a single confession. It did not rest on one clear eyewitness account of the kidnapping itself. Instead, it gathered objects and interpretations: ransom money found after the arrest, handwriting evidence connected to the ransom notes, Dr. John F. Condon's identification, tool marks, and wood evidence from the homemade ladder. The argument was not that one item alone explained everything. The argument was that the items fit together. The ransom money gave prosecutors one of their most concrete anchors. Authorities had circulated the serial numbers of the ransom bills to banks and businesses, turning the ransom payment into a searchable record. More than 2 years after the kidnapping, a suspicious $10 gold certificate appeared at a gasoline station at 127th Street and Lexington Avenue in New York City. The attendant recorded a license number. That number led to Hauptmann, who lived at 1279 East 222nd Street in the Bronx. After his arrest on September 19, 1934, more than $13,000 in ransom certificates was discovered in his garage. For prosecutors, that money could be presented as more than possession of unusual currency. It could be presented as a surviving piece of the ransom exchange. The bills had once been part of the $50,000 handed over by Dr. Condon on April 2, 1932. They had been intended to buy the safe return of Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., Instead, the promised directions led to a boat called Nellie near Martha's Vineyard, and the search failed. When marked ransom certificates later appeared in connection with Hauptmann, the prosecution could ask the jury to see the money as a link between the defendant and the ransom operation itself. But the money was not the whole case. The ransom notes were another battlefield. From the first note found on the nursery windowsill, demanding $50,000, to the later communications that shaped the ransom negotiations, writing had been central to the crime. The kidnapper, or kidnappers, had used written demands to control the situation from a distance. Those notes kept the family moving, instructed intermediaries, and directed hope toward false or uncertain places. By the time of the prosecution, handwriting evidence became one way to argue that the same human hand could be traced through the written record. Handwriting comparison is a form of interpretation. It asks observers to look at shapes, habits, strokes, and repeated forms, and then decide whether similarities are meaningful. In a case already saturated with public attention, that kind of evidence had special force and special vulnerability. To the prosecution, the ransom notes could connect Hauptmann to the communications that guided the crime. To the defense, such comparisons could be challenged as uncertain or subjective. The notes were not simply pieces of paper. They were contested objects, carrying both words and the claimed identity of the writer. Then there was Dr. John F. Condon. His role had always stood in the unusual middle ground between private desperation and public investigation. A retired Bronx school principal, he had entered the case after publishing an offer in the Bronx Home News and had used the code name Jafsie. He met a man calling himself John at Woodlawn Cemetery, near 233rd Street and Jerome Avenue in the Bronx on March 12, 1932. Later, on April 2nd, he handed over the ransom money and received the directions that pointed toward the boat near Martha's Vineyard. Condon's identification of Hauptmann would become one part of the prosecution's circumstantial case. That made memory itself a form of evidence. The meeting in the cemetery, the voice, the figure, the circumstances of negotiation, all became part of what the courtroom would have to evaluate. But memory, like handwriting, is not a physical object in the same way a bill or a ladder is. It depends on human recollection, and human recollection can be pressed, questioned, and challenged. Condon had not been a passive observer at the edge of the case. He had been inside the ransom process. That made him important, but it also made the interpretation of his testimony essential. The latter brought the case back to the physical scene near Hopewell, New Jersey. From the beginning, the homemade ladder had been one of the central objects associated with the abduction. Investigators understood it as the mechanism by which the nursery window could be reached. The FBI summary states that 2 sections of the ladder had been used to reach the window and that one section was split or broken where it joined the other. Mud traces in the nursery and unclear footprints beneath the window had shown the difficulty of preserving a perfect crime scene. The ladder, by contrast, remained available for study. By the time Hauptmann faced prosecution, the ladder was no longer only a rough object found after the child disappeared. It had become a potential map of manufacture. Tool marks could be examined. Nail hole patterns could be considered. Wood species and boards could be compared. In the prosecution's theory, the ladder could connect the physical act at the nursery window with the accused man's tools, materials, and working life as a carpenter. That was the larger importance of the wood and tool evidence. It promised to move the argument from possession of ransom money to preparation for the crime. The New Jersey State Archives states that trial evidence linked the wood used in the kidnap ladder to wood found in Hauptmann's home and to a lumber yard where he had formerly worked. Wood scientist Arthur Kohler of the United States Forest Service Forest Products Laboratory examined the ladder, and the United States Department of Agriculture describes the case as an early major use of wood forensics in a trial. Those details show why the prosecution's case became a contest over objects. A board was not only a board. A tool mark was not only a scratch. In the courtroom, materials could be treated as records of contact, cutting, repair, and origin. This was the shape of the case as it moved toward Flemington, New Jersey. Hauptmann had been indicted in Bronx County, New York, for extortion on September 26, 1934, and in Hunterdon County, New Jersey, for murder on October 8th. The trial would begin in January of 1935 at the Hunterdon County Courthouse in Flemington and would last more than 5 weeks. It would bring together prosecutor David T. Willents, Judge Thomas W. Trenchard, defense attorney Edward J. Riley, witnesses including Dr. Condon, and a public already trained by newspapers and newsreels to treat every development as national news. That public setting did not change the legal requirement of proof, but it changed the atmosphere in which proof was argued. The Lindbergh case had always been more than a local prosecution. It had involved a famous family, a rural estate, a ransom trail through New York, federal assistance, marked currency, and the expanding power of modern media. Now the courtroom would become the place where all of that attention narrowed onto evidence, notes, bills, tools, wood, and memory. A circumstantial case asks a jury to follow relationships. It asks whether separate facts converge or merely appear to converge. It asks whether possession, resemblance, identification, and material comparison form a reliable pattern. In Flemington, that question would become the center of the trial. The prosecution would try to show that the fragments did not float separately, but pointed in one direction. The defense would try to break that network apart. And among all the objects prepared for interpretation, the ladder stood apart. It had been present at the crime scene from the beginning, close to the nursery window and the physical act of abduction. By the time experts examined its boards, marks, and construction, it had become something more, a claimed bridge between the Lindbergh home near Hopewell and Hauptmann's own world of wood, tools, and work. The ladder stood apart because it belonged to two worlds at once. It was part of the scene outside the nursery window near Hopewell, New Jersey, where the abduction had begun. But it was also something made by human hands, measured, cut, joined, nailed, and carried. Unlike a spoken identification or a written ransom note, the ladder did not depend on memory or language. Its importance came from its material presence. It was wood, shaped into a tool, and investigators believed that its wood could be read. By the time Bruno Richard Hauptmann was brought into the case, the ladder had already been waiting in the evidence record for more than 2 years. It had been found in connection with the abduction on the Lindbergh estate, near the window from which Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. had disappeared. The FBI summary describes it as a homemade ladder, and from the beginning, its construction mattered. Investigators believed 2 sections of the ladder had been used to reach the second-floor nursery window. One section was split or broken where it joined another. That break was not just damage. It suggested stress, use, and a physical moment in the crime. In an ordinary burglary, a ladder might be treated mainly as an abandoned tool. In this case, it became one of the central exhibits in a national prosecution. The question was no longer only whether a ladder had reached the nursery. The question was whether the ladder could be connected to a particular man. That question brought the case into an early and important use of wood forensics. Arthur Kaler, a wood scientist with the United States Forest Service Forest Products Laboratory, examined the ladder. The United States Department of Agriculture later described the case as an early major use of wood forensics in a trial. That description matters because it places the Lindbergh case within a broader history of forensic science entering American courtrooms. The trial was not only about witnesses and ransom bills. It was also about whether scientific examination of a material object could help establish a chain between a crime scene and an accused person. Wood is not silent to an expert. It has species, grain, wear, saw marks, nail holes, and patterns left by tools and construction. A board can show how it was cut. It can show whether it came from a certain kind of lumber. It can carry marks that suggest how it was handled or shaped. In the Lindbergh case, the ladder was examined as an assembled object, but also as a collection of individual pieces. Each piece had a possible origin. Each surface might preserve evidence of work done before the night of the kidnapping. The prosecution's use of the ladder fit the larger structure of its case. The state did not present one single piece of evidence as the entire story. Instead, it arranged many pieces into a pattern: the ransom money discovered after Hauptmann's arrest, handwriting comparisons involving the ransom notes, Dr. John F. Condon's identification, tool marks, and the wood evidence from the ladder. The ladder's role was to give that pattern a physical bridge. If the money suggested contact with the ransom, and the handwriting evidence suggested contact with the notes, the wood evidence was meant to suggest contact with the means of entry itself. The New Jersey State Archives states that the trial evidence linked wood used in the kidnap ladder to wood found in Hauptmann's home and to a lumber yard where he had formerly worked. That was the core claim. The ladder was not merely said to be homemade. It was said to contain material that could be traced into Hauptmann's environment, his home, his work history, and a place where he had access to lumber. For a jury, that kind of evidence could carry a particular force. A ransom bill could pass from hand to hand. A note could be argued over as handwriting. A witness identification could be attacked through uncertainty, time, or memory. But a board had a different quality. It appeared concrete. It could be held, displayed, and compared. It could be described in the language of measurement and material science. The prosecution wanted the latter to feel less like a loose clue and more like a constructed connection. The importance of Arthur Kohler's work was not simply that he looked at wood. It was that he translated wood into courtroom meaning. In the laboratory and an expert examination, the ladder could be broken down into features, wood species, nail hole patterns, tool marks, and signs of construction. Those features became part of the prosecution's argument that the ladder had a history before it appeared at the Lindbergh home. It had not come from nowhere. It had been made from materials available to someone. It had been worked with tools. It had been assembled by a person with enough practical skill to build a usable ladder. That detail also mattered because Hauptmann was not presented as a stranger to wood or tools. The FBI identifies him as a German-born carpenter, a native of Saxony, Germany. In the courtroom narrative, that background made the ladder more significant. A carpenter had the knowledge to work with boards. A carpenter could understand how to make a ladder strong enough to reach a second-floor window. A carpenter could possess or use the kinds of tools that might leave marks on wood. The prosecution did not need the ladder to speak in a human voice. It needed the ladder to appear consistent with the defendant's world. But the ladder also reveals the risk at the center of the case. Circumstantial evidence depends on interpretation. A board linked to a home, a tool mark linked to a tool, or lumber linked to a former workplace must be explained, compared, and believed. The force of the evidence comes from expert testimony and from the jury's willingness to accept that the similarities are meaningful rather than coincidental. The defense's task, as with the rest of the circumstantial case, was to challenge that meaning. It could try to separate the ladder from the defendant or question whether the links were strong enough to carry the weight placed on them. This is why the ladder became more than an exhibit. It became a test of authority. Who had the power to interpret physical traces? What could an expert tell a jury about wood? How much certainty could be drawn from grain, nail holes, tool marks, and lumber sources? In a case already driven by newspaper attention and public pressure, the courtroom had to transform a rough wooden object into legal proof. That transformation depended on institutions: the United States Forest Service Forest Products Laboratory, the investigative agencies that preserved and presented the ladder, and the prosecutors who placed the evidence before the jury. The latter also returned the trial to the original violence of the crime. Much of the later investigation moved through cities, banks, gasoline stations, ransom bills, and handwriting comparisons. The marked money led to a gasoline station at 127th Street and Lexington Avenue in New York City. The recorded license number led to Hauptmann's address at 1279 East 222nd Street in the Bronx. The arrest led to ransom certificates found in his garage. Those were urban traces, financial traces, traces of circulation. The latter was different. It pointed back to the house near Hopewell. It pointed back to the window, the nursery, and the physical act of reaching a child's room from the outside. In that sense, it connected the most public part of the case, the trial, to the most private place in the story, the Lindbergh home. The courtroom could display the latter as evidence, but its meaning depended on the image of where it had been used, against the wall of a rural house, below the second-floor nursery, on the night of March 1st, 1932. That is why wood forensics mattered so deeply in the prosecution's structure. It did not merely add another technical claim. It helped convert the latter from a crime scene object into a claimed route between two worlds. On one side was the nursery window. On the other was Hauptmann's home, his tools, his background as a carpenter, and a lumber yard where he had formerly worked. The state's case asked the jury to see those worlds as connected by boards, marks, and expert comparison. As the trial in Flemington moved forward, this kind of evidence would be presented under extraordinary public attention. The Hunterdon County courtroom would become the place where objects were made to testify through experts, where ransom money and handwriting sat beside wood and tools, and where the country watched a murder case become a national spectacle. The latter had begun as a means of reaching a window. In court, it became something else, a structure on which part of the prosecution's entire case was built. By the time the latter reached the courtroom in Flemington, it was no longer only a wooden object from the ground beneath a nursery window. It had become an exhibit, a claim, and a test of authority. Experts could point to it. Lawyers could question it. Reporters could describe it. The jury could look at it and decide how much weight to give the story built around its boards. That was the atmosphere inside the Hunterdon County Courthouse in January of 1935, when Bruno Richard Hauptmann went on trial for murder. The case had traveled far from the quiet rural edge of Hopewell, New Jersey, where Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. had been taken almost 3 years earlier. It had moved through ransom notes, Bronx meetings, marked money, searches, federal coordination, and forensic comparisons. Now it entered a small county seat and became one of the most watched criminal proceedings in the country. The trial began in Flemington, New Jersey, and lasted more than 5 weeks. Its formal purpose was specific. Hauptmann was being tried in Hunterdon County for murder. But the public meaning of the proceeding was much larger. The kidnapped child was the son of Charles A. Lindbergh and Anne Morrow Lindbergh. The investigation had already become national news. The arrest of a German-born carpenter from the Bronx had given the public a defendant to focus on. In Flemington, the courtroom became the place where the country's fascination, grief, anger, and uncertainty gathered around a legal process. The trial was presided over by Judge Thomas W. Trenchard. The prosecution was led by David T. Willens. Hauptmann's defense attorney was Edward J. Riley. Around them was a crowded field of witnesses, law enforcement officers, experts, reporters, and spectators. The Hunterdon County Courthouse was not designed as a national stage, but in practice, that is what it became. The case brought the machinery of criminal law into contact with the machinery of mass attention. This is one reason the trial occupies such an important place in the history of American crime coverage. The evidence was not simply presented, it was watched being presented. Each exhibit and each identification arrived inside an atmosphere already charged by years of reporting. The courtroom did not create the public obsession, but it gave that obsession a structure. There was a judge's bench, a witness stand, tables for counsel, a jury box, and a defendant. The story that had been scattered across police files, newspapers, ransom communications, and private grief was now arranged into a sequence for 12 jurors. The prosecution's case was largely circumstantial. That point mattered then, and it matters in understanding the trial now. The state did not build its argument around a single confession or one simple, direct observation of the crime. Instead, it brought forward a network of evidence: the ransom money, handwriting comparisons, Dr. John F. Condon's identification, tool marks, and wood evidence from the latter. Each part was meant to reinforce the others. The case depended on accumulation. The ransom money gave the prosecution one of its clearest trails. Authorities had distributed serial numbers of the ransom bills to banks and businesses, and the search for marked gold certificates had become central to locating a suspect. In September of 1934, a suspicious $10 gold certificate had been used at a gasoline station at 127th Street and Lexington Avenue in New York City. The attendant recorded the car's license number. That number was traced to Hauptmann at 1279 East 222nd Street in the Bronx. After his arrest, more than $13,000 in ransom certificates was discovered in his garage. In court, those facts became more than investigative milestones. They became part of the prosecution's answer to a central question: how did money handed over in the ransom drop end up connected to Hauptmann? The marked bills were a mechanism of memory. They carried serial numbers that had been recorded and circulated before anyone knew where the trail would end. When the prosecution presented them, the money stood for the long reach of preparation, a ransom payment made in April of 1932, and a trace that helped bring officers to a Bronx address in September of 1934. The handwriting evidence carried another kind of claim. From the beginning, the ransom notes had been a way for the kidnapper or kidnappers to control the family's movements while remaining unseen. By the time of trial, those notes were not only communications, they were comparison material. The prosecution used handwriting evidence as part of its effort to link Hauptmann to the ransom demands. In a case shaped by written instructions, altered demands, and coded contact, handwriting became a contested form of identity. Then there was Dr. John F. Condon, the retired Bronx school principal, known by the code name Jafsie. His role had always been unusual. He was not simply a bystander who later remembered something. He had inserted himself into the ransom process after publishing an offer in the Bronx Home News. He had met a man calling himself John at Woodlawn Cemetery, near 233rd Street and Jerome Avenue in the Bronx. He had handed over the ransom money on April 2, 1932, and received directions claiming the child could be found on a boat called Nellie near Martha's Vineyard. At trial, Condon's identification became one part of the prosecution's circumstantial case against Hauptmann. The courtroom significance of that moment was clear. A private negotiation conducted under public pressure was being translated into sworn testimony. The strange geography of the ransom trail, the Bronx, the cemetery, the money, the false promise of a boat, was brought back into the courthouse and placed before the jury. The latter evidence brought still another kind of authority into the room. Arthur Kohler of the United States Forest Service Forest Products Laboratory had examined the latter, and the United States Department of Agriculture later described the case as an early major use of wood forensics in a trial. The New Jersey State Archives states that the trial evidence linked the wood used in the kidnap ladder to wood found in Hauptmann's home and to a lumber yard where he had formerly worked. This was evidence rooted in materials, wood species, tool marks, nail hole patterns, and construction details. For the jury, the prosecution's argument asked that these separate categories be seen together. Money, handwriting, memory, wood, and tools were not presented as isolated curiosities. They were presented as pieces of a larger design. The marked ransom certificates placed Hauptmann in contact with the money. The handwriting comparisons pointed toward the ransom notes. Condon's identification connected him to the ransom negotiations. The wood and tool evidence connected his world of carpentry to the ladder found at the Lindbergh estate. The defense, led by Edward J. Riley, faced that network rather than a single strand. In a circumstantial case, the struggle is often over connections. One side argues that the links form a coherent chain. The other seeks to loosen them, separate them, or show that each is less certain than it appears. The Flemington trial turned on that conflict, whether the objects and memories assembled by the state proved guilt beyond the courtroom's required standard, or whether they left room for doubt. But outside the legal argument, something else was happening. The trial itself had become an event. The Library of Congress would later describe the media frenzy surrounding the 1935 Hauptmann trial as an important turning point in courtroom visibility. The attention was not incidental. It shaped the way the proceeding was remembered. Reporters, photographers, radio interests, and spectators pressed against the boundaries of the court. The trial became a spectacle, not because the murder charge was any less serious, but because the seriousness of the charge unfolded under unprecedented public scrutiny. This is the central tension of Flemington. The courtroom was supposed to narrow the case, to move from national anxiety to admissible evidence and sworn testimony. Yet the public gaze widened it again. Every witness carried a story beyond the courtroom. Charles Lindbergh and Anne Morrow Lindbergh were not anonymous parents. They were nationally known figures whose private loss had been followed for years. Betty Gow was not only the nurse who discovered the child missing, she was part of the first hour of the case. Condon was not only a witness, he was the ransom intermediary whose public offer had pulled him into the investigation. Experts were not only specialists, they were figures in a larger debate over what science and comparison could prove. On February 13, 1935, the jury found Bruno Richard Hauptmann guilty of first-degree murder. That verdict is the documented legal endpoint of the Flemington trial. After more than 5 weeks of testimony and argument, the state's circumstantial case had persuaded the jury. The courtroom stage, for that moment, resolved into a formal judgment. Yet the verdict did not end the historical meaning of the trial. Flemington had shown how a murder case could become a national media event while still being processed through ordinary legal forms: indictment, evidence, witnesses, objections, instructions, deliberation, verdict. The old courthouse had held both a criminal proceeding and a public drama. Its legacy would continue beyond Hauptmann's conviction, into the questions that followed about cameras, radio, courtroom decorum, and the limits of public access. The case that began at a nursery window had now passed through a courtroom watched by the nation. What remained was the sentence, the execution, and the institutional reaction to the spectacle itself, the moment when American law and the American press began to reckon with what Flemington had revealed. After Flemington, the case no longer moved through the same kind of crowded courtroom rhythm. The testimony had ended. The exhibits had been handled. The jury had returned its verdict. Bruno Richard Hauptmann had been found guilty of first-degree murder on February 13, 1935. But the public story did not simply stop at the courthouse door. The Lindbergh case had already become something larger than a single prosecution. It had moved through a nursery window, a ransom trail, marked gold certificates, handwriting comparisons, wood analysis, and weeks of courtroom attention. By the time the verdict came, the case had tested not only the evidence against one defendant, but also the ability of American institutions to manage a criminal proceeding under intense national observation. The final act took place not in Flemington, but in Trenton. On April 3, 1936, Hauptmann was executed by electrocution at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. With that execution, the formal criminal case reached its end. The state had charged him, tried him, convicted him, and carried out the sentence. In the official sequence, there was a beginning and an end: indictment, trial, verdict, execution. Yet the historical consequences were less easily contained. The Lindbergh kidnapping had been a family catastrophe from the first hour, but it had also become a national event almost immediately because of who the family was and because of the press world into which the crime erupted. Charles A. Lindbergh was not only a father, he was one of the most recognizable Americans of his time. Anne Morrow Lindbergh was drawn into the same public glare. Their child's disappearance from the second-floor nursery near Hopewell, New Jersey, transformed a private house into a national crime scene. By the time Hauptmann stood trial in Hunterdon County Courthouse in Flemington, the country had already followed the case for years. Newspapers, radio, and newsreels had helped turn the investigation into a shared public experience. The ransom notes, the cemetery meeting with Dr. John F. Condon, the failed instructions to the boat called Nellie, the discovery near Mount Rose, the marked currency, and the arrest in the Bronx had all become part of an expanding public narrative. The trial intensified that narrative. The courtroom became the central stage on which law, science, celebrity, grief, and spectacle met. That is why the aftermath matters. The Library of Congress states that courtroom drawing took hold as a result of the media frenzy around the Hauptmann trial. That detail may seem, at first, like a small change in the visual history of American justice, but it points to something deeper. When cameras become a problem, institutions look for substitutes. When public appetite for courtroom images remains high, but direct photography is restricted or discouraged, the sketch artist becomes a way to show the courtroom without turning the courtroom itself into a full visual performance. In that sense, courtroom drawing was not only an artistic practice. It was also a compromise between access and control. It acknowledged that the public wanted to see trials, especially trials of national significance. But it also reflected a growing fear that the machinery of publicity could overwhelm the machinery of justice. The Hauptmann trial helped make that fear concrete. The Library of Congress also states that the media coverage led to a special committee on cooperation between the press, radio, and bar, and later to the American Bar Association's Canon 35, discouraging cameras in courtrooms. This was one of the most important institutional legacies of the case. The question was no longer only whether reporters had the right to cover trials. It was how far coverage could go before it altered the atmosphere of the proceeding itself. Canon 35 represented a formal response to that concern. It discouraged cameras in courtrooms, and later, federal courtroom bans on photography and radio were in place by 1946, as summarized by the Library of Congress. The chain of events matters. A spectacular trial helped produce a professional and legal backlash against spectacle. The same case that had drawn the nation toward the courtroom also helped push cameras away from it. That tension is central to the legacy of the Lindbergh kidnapping and the Hauptmann trial. Public trials are meant to be visible in a democratic society. Courts do not operate entirely in secret. Reporters have long served as intermediaries between legal proceedings and the public. But Flemington showed how visibility could become pressure. It showed how the presence of mass attention could change the meaning of ordinary courtroom acts. A witness was not just testifying before a judge and jury. A lawyer was not just questioning for the record. An exhibit was not just being introduced into evidence. In the Lindbergh case, each of these acts also entered a national stream of narration, commentary, repetition, and judgment. The courtroom became both a legal space and a media space. That dual identity did not end with Hauptmann's execution. It became part of the way later courts, bar associations, journalists, and broadcasters thought about the boundary between public knowledge and courtroom order. The problem was not simple. Too little visibility could shield the justice system from scrutiny. Too much spectacle could threaten fairness, dignity, and attention to evidence. The Lindbergh case did not solve that problem. It made it impossible to ignore. It also left a second institutional legacy, the reshaping of law enforcement power. Earlier in the case, the Federal Kidnapping Act, also called the Lindbergh Law, made kidnapping involving interstate transportation a federal offense. That development belonged to the same larger story. A crime that began in New Jersey helped change the relationship between local police, state authority, and federal investigation. The New Jersey State Police had initially assumed charge after Hopewell police were notified. The FBI first acted only in an auxiliary capacity because there was no federal jurisdiction. Then federal coordination expanded, and the case helped push kidnapping into the national legal framework when interstate transportation was involved. So the Lindbergh case changed more than headlines. It affected federal law. It affected investigative practice. It elevated forensic claims in public understanding, from handwriting comparisons to marked money to the wood evidence examined by Arthur Kohler of the United States Forest Service Forest Products Laboratory. It helped demonstrate how objects could be made to speak in court and how expert testimony could become part of a national story. But the final and perhaps most visible legacy lies in the phrase at the center of this episode, America's first media trial. That does not mean it was the first American trial covered by newspapers, or the first crime to fascinate the public. It means that the Lindbergh case arrived at a moment when modern publicity could gather around a criminal proceeding with unusual force. Celebrity, grief, forensic evidence, law enforcement, newspapers, radio, and courtroom drama converged. The result was not just coverage of a case. It was the transformation of a case into a national event. From the Nursery Window near Hopewell to the execution chamber in Trenton, the path of the case was marked by attempts to impose order on chaos. Investigators tried to read mud traces, footprints, ransom notes, ladder rails, nail holes, tool marks, serial numbers, and handwriting. Prosecutors tried to arrange those fragments into a coherent argument. The defense challenged that argument. The jury returned a verdict. The state carried out the sentence. And around all of it, the press recorded, amplified, and shaped public attention. That is why the ending cannot be only the death of Bruno Richard Hauptmann on April 3, 1936. In legal terms, that was the end point. In institutional terms, the case continued in the rules and habits it helped produce. It continued in courtroom sketches. It continued in restrictions on cameras. It continued in debates over radio, photography, and the public image of justice. It continued in the memory of a trial where the nation watched the law perform under a glare it had not yet learned how to manage. The Lindbergh Kidnapping remains a true crime landmark because of the terror of the original act, the fame of the family, the long ransom trail, the discovery of the child's body near Mount Rose, and the prosecution of Hauptmann. But it also remains historically important because it revealed a new kind of American criminal proceeding, one in which the courtroom was not only a place of judgment, but a theater of national attention. The case began with absence, an empty nursery, a missing child, a note on a windowsill. It ended with institutions trying to define what the public should be allowed to see, hear, and record when justice is at work. Between those 2 points, American law, evidence, and media all changed shape. And that is the quiet legacy of Flemington. Not only a verdict, not only an execution, a warning, preserved in archives and courtroom practice, that when a criminal trial becomes a national spectacle, the law must decide not just what is true, but how truth should be seen.